Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Penn Yan Action Coalition's ongoing discussion of Francisco Cantú's The Line Becomes a River. And this is it. This is our final day of this series of discussions in this format. Rest assured, we will be continuing. The Penn Yan Action Coalition existed well before this series of events and will exist into the foreseeable future. So this is not the end of the Penn Yan Action Coalition's activities, but this does bring to an end the discussion of this book that we have brought to the community's attention these past, almost a month and a half now. We've been working on this. So we thank you all for having been a part of it, and we thank all those who might find these videos in the future, either here on Facebook or where they are posted on YouTube as well. As we finish up today, we're going to be discussing the theme of the author's purpose. We're pretty much just right on the last couple of pages of the book, where Cantú has made clear his or at least begun to make clear his purpose through his author's note. So our compatriot Claudia's topic for this session was author's purpose. Hi, Mickey and Ed. Glad you could be here. And hi, everybody else who is out there watching. So Claudia writes for us, Cantú states that his writing, quote, his writing was a way of charting his involvement with an institution largely indifferent to human life, end quote. That's on page 254. Hey, Claudia. Hey, Scarlett. And that hundreds are, quote, losing their lives by design, an assertion freely admitted by Doris Meissner, the commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service from 1993 to 2000. Hey, Pat. He further states that, quote, the true crisis at the border is not one of surging crossings or growing criminality, but of our own increasing disregard for human life. That's on page 262. He says that he wants his writing, quote, to resonate more deeply within the soul than the mind, on page 253. What does he mean by that? What does he hope to accomplish with this book? How do you know? Why does he include the following quotation from Susan Sontag? Quote, compassion is an unstable emotion. It needs to be translated into action or it withers. Page 266. What does Cantú place at the end of the book and why? I'm getting some flickers on my screen. Is everything showing up okay on the end of you guys viewing this at home, or am I lagging at all or freezing or anything? It's hard to tell if these flickers are just little video weirdness on my end, but if we're having trouble with the connection, I want to find out before we get in too far. I know it takes a minute for your comments to pop up, but while I'm waiting to see if you can let me know about that, I will just go back through the questions that Claudia has given us. So Cantú states that his writing was a way of charting his involvement with an institution largely indifferent to human life, and that hundreds are losing their lives by design, an assertion freely admitted by Doris Meissner, the commissioner of the INS, from 1993 to 2000. He further states that, quote, the true crisis at the border is not one of surging crossings or growing criminality, but of our own increasing disregard for human life. He says that he wants his writing to, quote, resonate more deeply within the soul than the mind. He wants his writing to resonate more deeply within the soul than the mind. What does he mean by that? What does he hope to accomplish with this book? How do you know? Why does he include this quotation from Susan Sontag? Compassion is an unstable emotion. It needs to be translated into action or it withers. What does Cantú place at the end of his book, and why? Okay, Mickey is reporting that they are fine on their end, so hopefully the little flickers I'm getting are just weirdness on my end. Okay, so we've got comments from 3 of our Action Coalition planners today. And remember, if you out there in TV land have comments as we go along, please do chime in the comments to this video and let us know what you are thinking. So Cindy writes, as I read the first paragraph in the author's note, I am struck with a feeling of Francisco's resignation. Can we really change things? Can we really make positive changes? Why should we even try? Because that's what we do. We try again and again and again. Susan B. Anthony died before women were, quote, given the right to vote. And as an aside, Cindy adds, why did it have to be given to us? But she worked and worked and worked. Moments of discouragement, I'm sure there were many. That's what I want written on my tombstone, Cindy says. She tried. She continues, I am sure that Francisco had many moments of discouragement, hopefully not despair. The writing of this book is evidence that he did not despair. Cindy cites a email signature block that she has seen in emails from a compatriot of hers from the Citizens Climate Lobby, whose email signature reads, paraphrased from Samuel Johnson, an English writer and moralist, there is almost nothing worthwhile that does not require hard, persistent, organized work or yield to it. There is almost nothing worthwhile that does not require hard, persistent, organized work or yield to it. So if you want to change something, if you want to get something done, it takes hard, persistent, organized work. And also the things that's, in reference to maybe some situations we want to create in the world, but also in reference to things as they are in the world. There's nothing that is in the world that will not yield to those things, to hard, persistent, organized work. And that is, of course, the hard part. Getting all 3 of those factors together for a sustained period of time is the hardest thing you can do. Because it takes more than 1 or 2 of us. It takes a movement, right? Cindy continues, as I am writing this, an interview with Noam Chomsky, political dissident and activist, is on Democracy Now! On the radio. My ears perked up when I heard the question, how do you stay hopeful? He thoughtfully answered, the groups working to make things better give him hope. Francisco, listed in the back of his book in a section titled Getting Involved, many organizations that are working towards improving immigration issues. Francisco also lists many further readings. We must educate ourselves before we can expect to make positive change. Francisco's image of the situation at the border, quote, has been like watching a loved one slip into the grip of an incurable disease for which I myself served as a carrier. That's stunning, Cindy says, particularly in the middle of the pandemic. Let us not be carriers of the problems. Rather, may we be solvers of the problems. We need to realize the power of public outcry, as demonstrated against the policy of family separation. Francisco gives example after example of the inhumanity being perpetrated at the border. If one doesn't grab you, the next one will, and they all grab you. And if they all grab you, a mountain of yuck grows before our eyes, a mountain that we need to climb one step at a time. So as each of those examples plays out in text, on TV and films, it begins to look pretty daunting and pretty nasty, but we must climb one step at a time. As Francisco writes on page 253, one of his principal goals in this book, quote, was to create space for readers to inhabit an emergent sense of horror at the suffering. It seeks to function as literature rather than reportage, to resonate more deeply within the soul than in the mind, end quote. Does this say that we are more apt to try to remedy something when something resonates deeply within the soul rather than the mind? Slavery, civil rights, equal rights, and on and on. And I'm certainly a strong believer in the power of art to slip under what are normally pretty impregnable defenses and get people to change a little more readily than, reams of official documents and things like that. So I think that Cantú's approach certainly resonates with me. Cindy continues, I find it interesting to read that Francisco on page 253, when he left the Border Patrol, had not intended, quote, to write publicly about his experiences there at the border. He says that he began to, quote, revisit the journals I had kept during my years on the job as a way to make sense of where I had been, what I had seen, what I had done and not done. What came to my mind immediately, Cindy says, was the possible importance of journaling about the experience in which we now find ourselves, again, to make sense of where we have been, what we have seen, what we have done and not done. Journaling is very powerful. I've been trying to keep a plague journal during all of this. It's hard to keep up with, but I think it'll be a very interesting firsthand document for myself in future years. Cindy goes on, I was unfamiliar with the word commodification from page 254, the commodification of migrants' lives. So to create out of living people something to be bought and sold and traded. And Cindy very rightly indicates this as another example of a lack of identity. It's hard to think of someone as human if they are something to make you profit in one way or another. And I'm not sure whether that passage in the book is referring to prisons that are profiting off of the imprisonment of migrants, or the coyotes who are guiding migrants over the border, or some other factor that I'm not thinking of, probably a little bit of everything, right? But the commodification of our fellow human beings is, that's what we did to African slaves and other slaves, isn't it? You stop seeing people as human when they are a commodity. Cindy finishes by saying, I kind of wish I had read the author's note before I started at the beginning of the book. I think that it would have been a help, a guide. However, I think that reading from the beginning was the way to touch and reach into my soul. So that's certainly important. Having read the author's note first might have obviated the role that Cantú placed in the way he created this as a work of art to move us in our hearts more than in our minds. And if any of you have any thoughts about that, agree or disagree with the notion that maybe it would have been helpful to read the author's note at first. Got some comments over here that have come in while I've been reading. Pat says 1 or 2 are the beginning of a movement. A revolution requires about 7% of the population. I remember, was that last summer or so, a social scientist put out their findings that there is that specific percentage of a population that once it gets out in the street, that's it. That leads to change. I found that very interesting. Claudia has written, I like Cindy's observations. I think that even though the fight is hard, Cantú must believe that his book will make a difference or he wouldn't have written it. He says he wants to touch the soul and not the mind. I think he means that he didn't intend his book to be a scholarly book, even though it is, but something that will touch our souls and cause us to act. And Scarlett adds, yes, touching the soul is more likely to lead to action. And I think we just kind of grasp that intuitively, don't we? It's rare that just a dry recitation of facts moves us in much one way or another. Maybe it gives us a sense of satisfaction if it's something we approve of, or outrage if it's something we don't approve of. but it's unlikely to get us up out of our seats. And that's not to say that facts and being factual and truthful is not important, but to weave those facts into a story. Human beings are creatures of story. That's been true since we gathered around the first fire and scratched Tales of the Hunt onto the cave walls. It's story that moves us. And speaking of Scarlett, our last commenter here so far on the live video, I will move on to Scarlett's comments that she sent me earlier. She says, there are so many statements and questions in the author's note. One that stood out for me was noted by Claudia from page 262, quote, the true crisis at the border is not one of surging crossings or growing criminality, but of our increasing disregard for human life. The statement encompasses the issues we've discussed: violence, identity, accountability, necessity for change. Then comes the challenge. What small and big steps can we take that will bring the recognition and support of the humanity of all persons? At this moment, Scarlett says, I am feeling somewhat overwhelmed. I think we're all with you there, Scarlett. Absolutely. So we can take strength in that. But she says, I feel a sense of urgency and accountability that the task of advocating persistently must begin. Our humanity depends on it. And I got to say that the folks that have been involved in the Penn Yan Action Coalition talk about advocating persistently. A story moved them to action, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago now. And they have consistently worked on this cause. Each of them had separately, I imagine, been interested in it before that time. It wouldn't have registered for them if they weren't, but something happened, a story, which in this case was an event that occurred in our neighborhood, in our backyard. And they have done a wonderful, amazing job of leading on this issue in our area where migrant workers are an essential part of our economy. They're part of our community. I see them at the library where I work. We see them in around town. They are not just commodities that can be, if they get swept up in raids and disappear, that it makes no difference to our lives. It certainly does, both on on those levels of, civic output, but also they're our friends, they're our neighbors. Some of them become our family members. So I just want to applaud the Action Coalition for all of the work that they have done and the persistent advocacy that they have modeled since that time. So bravo. Claudia wonders if the book would have had the same impact if Jose's personal story had been left out. Very good point. I have gathered that the aspects of the book that deal with Jose is really where that narrative aspect comes in. It's he's a character that you can follow and get to know. And it seems to be a very, all of you have brought up Jose in our discussions. So he's been a very impactful part of the narrative. Mickey adds, Claudia's note that it's not a scholarly work goes to the style of not using lots of quotations as he relates conversations. The book is Cantú's story of his activities. Yep, he didn't sit down to act like a reporter or somebody writing a dissertation for their doctorate. And it's interesting I forget someone over here, I think Cindy mentioned that Cantú began the writing process by looking back at his journals, and there's that immediacy in the writing of the book that comes from that daily diary keeping origin. Let's see here. Okay. And let's see, the last set of remarks I received ahead of time are from Mickey. And Mickey says, I want to add to Claudia's comment about the Sontag quote at the end of the book. So again, the Sontag quote was, compassion is an unstable emotion. It needs to be translated into action or it withers. After that quote, Cantú writes, But in the end, our feelings and our tears are useless unless they compel us to act in a way that may someday improve the situation. Mickey continues, I think here he raises two issues also raised by Cindy and Claudia, the need for action and persistence, since he says someday, not necessarily now, but working toward that goal. Of course, our question is how, and I think we of the Penn Yan Action Coalition have done this community read as a way to try something, and now that we have, we must assess that and its results. Thus the need for input from our audience, and if we have one, what would they like or not like us to do going forward? So as part of that persistent advocacy work that the Penn Yan Action Coalition has been doing right along and that this read is a part of, now the next step will be for the folks out there who have been reading with us, who have been commenting with us, who have been sitting at home during this quarantine, thinking about these issues, thinking about our activities and what comes next, to give us some feedback. So yes, we will be getting a survey out that will be as publicly available as we can make it. So you can let us know what you think, what action you would take, what you want to take, what you want to see happen. So stay tuned for that. Mickey continues. As he continues to the final pages, Cantú quotes philosopher Derek Jensen, quote, those of us who care about life need to force accountability onto those who do not. We must learn to be accountable to ourselves, our consciences, our neighbors, and the non-human members of our community. End quote. And then adds his own ideas. Small impulses and interactions have the power to lead us back toward humanity, and heeding them can be a means of extricating ourselves from the systems of thought and policy that perpetuate detachment. That's a thick sentence. Let me go back to that. Small impulses and interactions have the power to lead us back toward humanity, and heeding them can be a means of extricating ourselves from the systems of thought and policy that perpetuate detachment. So follow those small impulses and follow those small interactions that brings us back to humanity and our sense of our shared humanity. And that can get us out from this sense that the way we think is always the way we've thought, and it should be the way we've always thought. Policy is the way it's always been. It's the way it will always be. There's no changing it. Returning toward humanity will show us that those notions are false, and that systems of thought can change, systems of policy can change, and by knowing they can change, we will no longer be so detached. Our apathy that we all suffer from sometimes because the issue is too big or the issue is too far away will start to ebb, and we will see that we can make a difference. Mickey continues, so he is advocating for work in any form, big or small, as long as we keep alert to what needs to be changed, and that our actions must be attempts to change the minds of others, especially those in power, to see the humanity of people and the value of the natural world. It's the how that is the big question. But he does give us ideas with a list of organizations we can either join or emulate in his Get Involved list. Mickey concludes, I also think his ideas of speaking to the souls of people can be interpreted as changing hearts. As we've said many times over our discussions, our actions affect people. Yes, we count them in many ways. We're undergoing the census right now. We're counting people, literally rendering them to numbers. But each of those numbers is a life with a huge connection to the world in multiple ways. Tug the threads of each life to see the tangle of the fabric of that life with the world at the macro and the micro level. I thought that was a lovely image. Tug the threads of each life to see the tangle of the fabric of that life with the world. We are all interconnected. We've got another comment from Mickey. Oh, it's from Ed over here on the chat. It seems that over 500 people within our Senate and Congress spend more of their time in debating about the military walls, oil, roads, even though important, rather than things that involve compassion and empathy towards our fellow human beings, like healthcare, immigration, social service, education, air and water quality, and economic diversity. Where are their priorities? It's disheartening, to say the least. And Claudia adds, we have so much empathy for the lives that have been impacted by this current coronavirus crisis. I hope that our empathy extends beyond ourselves to others in whatever crisis and suffering they find themselves. And Claudia also says, kudos, Mickey, on the tangled threads metaphor. Truly, our lives are interwoven. Absolutely. And I think, Claudia's statement there just kind of sums up the raison d'etre of this group and this effort, and many other, why do people get together in communities like ours and elsewhere in the country and the world, but to find a way to extend empathy, to find empathy for the other and ease their suffering. And ultimately that's the goal. That seems to be the end of the comments that we had ahead of time. Keep commenting here on this video if you are so inclined. But I do want to thank everyone who has viewed these sessions. And especially a thank you to all the members of the Penn Yan Action Coalition. And I did not jot down everyone's names ahead of time, so hopefully I won't forget anyone, but Mickey and Ed, Claudia, Cindy, Scarlett, Nancy, Deb, Peggy. I really hope I haven't forgotten anyone. Dan, can't forget Dan, who was good enough to convene and step back. So thank you to all of you wonderful people. You're doing amazing work. I'm so pleased to be helpful to it in some small way. And I hope all of you who have been with us so far and who may join with us in the future will stick with us, watch for the survey we're going to put out, stay with us as we figure out, as Scarlett says, what next? Return to that image of the tangled threads metaphor and consider what next. If some concrete action at any level, community, county, state, whatever, national, can come out of discussions that we have over the next few months, over the next year or years, that would be amazing. And I think that we have the capacity to do it. All right. With that, I will bring us to an end for today. But again, a big thank you. Keep commenting. Find these videos on the Penn Yan Public Library's YouTube page. Tell your friends who aren't on Facebook. That's where they can find them, or just watch them here. All right. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe and well, and we will be back with a survey and next steps at some point in the near future. Good night.